is located in West Fairmount Park. Now, the previous Franklin Outside videos we've done have been coming to you from East Fairmount Park, but we've crossed the Schuylkill River and now we're here on the west side. And we're at the Belmont Plateau because this is the site of the culminating event of the very, very first Earth Week. Now, if you're not familiar with what the Earth Week is, the very first Earth Week was essentially a week-long celebration in recognition of the Earth. Now, in 1970, the very first Earth Day was really inspired by Senator Gaylord Nelson, a senator from Wisconsin. And here in Philadelphia, there were many young youth activists. If you want to walk towards me a little bit, you're walking into a ditch there. We don't want to send our camera person tumbling here. Now, inspired in part by Gaylord Nelson, folks at the University of Pennsylvania in the design school, many students there, were inspired to stage political protests in what they thought was a response to poor management of our environment. They were recognizing really heavy air pollution and water pollution, and in many ways recognizing some of the same challenges that we're still dealing with here today, not just in Philadelphia, but across the United States and across the globe, certainly. And perhaps the precipitating event, or the event immediately preceding some of those initial protests, was an oil spill off of the west coast of California, actually. And folks were absolutely outraged. And in 1970, we also have to recognize that we are sort of on the following years of the 1960s, which were a very, very tumultuous time, of course, in the United States. If we haven't learned about that just yet in our history books, we will learn that Americans were experiencing a lot of civil unrest, shall we say. There was a lot of angst around the Vietnam War. There were early political protests around the feminist movement and civil rights issues, and of course environmental issues as well. And so the very, very first Earth Day protests really were inspired by that energetic political energy that a lot of young Americans were feeling. And that was in fear for the health of their environment. So, what was so important, what was so great about the Belmont Plateau in all of this? Well, on the eve of Earth Day, so April 21st, 1970, all the way across town at Independence Hall, just about 7,000 to 10,000 citizens gathered to, again, call political action to these environmental issues. The following day, there was more of a festival-like atmosphere. And that festival happened right here on the plateau. And I have to say that it's a little bit tingly. I'm feeling a little bit tingly being here because there were anywhere from 10,000 upwards of 30,000 folks that gathered here. And politicians spoke, activists spoke, musicians played music. It was a very energetic moment. And ultimately, what all of these protests led to in the United States was perhaps one of the most energized periods of government regulations and laws being passed to help support environmental causes and concerns. The most notable, of course, was the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Of course, we still have that today. Other acts that would come right around the same time were NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. This established a board of advisors for the President of the United States on environmental issues. Also the Clean Water Act, and led the way later on to a number of, the Clean Air Act, which then led on to a number of updates in pursuing subsequent years, So I'm just going to take a quick look around to see where we can park ourselves to continue our conversation. So luckily it looks like these patio tables over here have opened up, so we'll head this way now. And as I mentioned, 50 years ago, what Earth Day was about, yes, it was about inspiring an awareness of and an appreciation for the environment. And it also, at its roots, was a real political act. And I think that we need to recognize that. And I think we also need to acknowledge that right now, Earth Day 2020, we can sort of tap into a similar energy if we so choose to. And so Earth Day 2020's theme this year is called Climate Action. So quite appropriate, isn't it? We're still addressing the same issues of pollution, but climate change is a little bit different from air and water pollution on their own, because it's sort of a higher, overarching, bigger global issue. So this year, as I mentioned, climate action is the theme of Earth Day. And I'm certainly inspired by a lot of youth activists that are already working in this space. They're already drawing attention to the concerns that they have over climate change, and for really good reason. Some folks have referred to this young generation as the climate generation. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, if you were born in the year 2000 or after, you've never lived in a year that hasn't been a record hot year in the history of all of our weather records, all of our climate records. So that says something, and I think that says, I think that inspires a lot of alarm and a lot of concern, and rightfully so. But Earth Day, and again, climate action being our theme, gives us an opportunity, I think, to take an action to really feel like we can take control of that issue. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about here. So we just headed down the Belmont Plateau, and we're going to get ourselves situated at one of these tables over here. If we want to continue to that one just there, thank you. And here's how I'd like this to go. We sort of got a little bit of history of Earth Day, and I mentioned that I'm really inspired by very similar themes that were happening 50 years ago that are still happening today. Again, 50 years ago, youth activists were leading this movement. And it wasn't just youth activists, right? In fact, the Franklin Institute had a role in a series of teach-ins and a series of educational lectures that happened in and around Philadelphia back in 1970, including one out at the Chestnut Hill College. The head of our then research division actually gave an address and a lecture out at Chestnut Hill College, which I think is pretty cool. We're still doing that here today. The legacy, I think, of spreading good scientific truths and earth and environmental education. Hopefully, we're carrying that torch forward. So we're going to get ourselves set up here, and as we're getting set up, I'll just take that from you while you come around. And we're going to get set up and talk about some of those climate actions that you can take with your family. And then we're going to pivot to discussing some citizen science actions that I think are quite exciting for those of us that are interested in doing more beyond what we're able to do in our individual homes and in our individual families. So I'm just going to get myself set up here, and I think I might come actually to the other side of the table because it's a little breezy. How about that? Okay, figuring it out as we go. Thank you for your patience. So as mentioned now, I'd love to go over some climate actions, and really what I'm looking for here is an opportunity to share with you what I deem as some surprising climate change actions. Now, many of us are familiar with many resources out there that tell us a little bit about how we can make our lives more environmentally friendly. And maybe this has to do with water conservation, and maybe this has to do with electricity conservation, and certainly all of those issues are of grave concern and of grave importance. And if you and your families are taking climate-friendly actions today, we'd love to hear what they're all about. Go ahead and drop those in the comments section and share those with us. But I think for the purposes of today's little chat, I'd like to hone in on one particular project, and it is one that is really comprehensive in sharing its recommendations around those actions that can be most impactful when it comes to addressing climate change. And of course, I'm talking about a book called Drawdown. Can you see that okay? So I brought this along with me in my field pack today. And if you haven't heard about the Drawdown project before, it is the result of a number of researchers and scientists and really policy experts getting together and thinking about which individual actions are most impactful and how we could get them passed on a legal level to deal with climate change. And I'd like to go through some of those top, most impactful actions, because as I mentioned, I think some of them are possibly really surprising for those of us that even deem ourselves quite environmentally friendly. And again, as we're going, we're happy to take your questions here about those actions that you're adopting in your own lifestyles to become more environmentally friendly. So what I've done here is I've marked off a couple pages for us So we're going to reference this book quite heavily today in a way that we haven't in previous discussions. Now, if you don't have access to this textbook, no problem at all. I also like using this resource because it's freely available online. Remember, again, this project is called Project Drawdown. Draw down, D-R-A-W, down, simply because it means we're drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. So what are those actions that we could take either individually or as a global society to really, as rapidly as possible, reduce the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere? And I suppose I should say, before we go down that rabbit hole, why the heck are we talking about carbon in the first place? Well, many of us out there will be familiar, of course, that the basis of human-caused climate change has to do with our production and our release, our rampant release of carbon-bearing gases into the atmosphere. We call those greenhouse gases. Also heat-trapping gases. So greenhouse gases are heat-trapping gases. It means that once we release them into the atmosphere, the higher concentrations there are, the more they begin to warm temperatures within the Earth's atmosphere. So of course, if we'd like to reduce and reverse that warming trend, we want to pull them, we want to draw them down out of the atmosphere. Okay, so can anybody out there guess what the absolute top action is? And I'll give you a second. So I can't actually hear your answers. But I can hear your minds working out there. And when I speak with folks, I speak with teachers, or I speak with visitors to the museum, they always tell me that it's about driving less, right? Or it's about taking fewer airplane rides, right? Well, certainly those individual actions can be very, very useful, right? But on the global scale, this is surprising to me. The very, very top recommendation from Project Drawdown is actually to adjust refrigeration technologies. So what the heck does that mean, refrigeration technologies? Well, refrigeration is exactly what you think it is. Just as your fridge keeps stuff cold, it turns out that the global system uses a lot of refrigeration technologies. We use it to keep in our own homes, certainly our fridges use it to keep our food cold, but we also use massive storage facilities to keep the food that heads off from farms and from factories cool before it gets ultimately to the consumer's home. We also use refrigerants, of course, in our air conditioners. Now, here's a really, really interesting trend that is sort of a result of our own doing. As the atmosphere begins to as the atmosphere continues to warm up, we're seeing increased usage across the globe of air conditioning units. Now, this used to be something that was seen as really a luxury, but it's become a very, very common and accessible technology. And why not? We should be able to keep comfortable in our own homes, shouldn't we? There's no reason that just because you have more money to be able to afford an expensive air conditioner that you should get to stay cool, but folks that can't afford the expensive air conditioner shouldn't. Of course, it's silly to assume that we should get rid of air conditioners. But what we need to do is change the technology that we're using in those air conditioners. Now, it turns out that refrigerants use very, very harmful chemicals called hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. Now, HFCs are very, very potent greenhouse gases, or remember, heat-trapping gases is that term that we like to use. Whereas carbon dioxide can warm up the atmosphere, it turns out that these HFCs can have a warming effect that's anywhere from 4,000 to 9,000 times as strong as that carbon dioxide. So even if we only have a little bit of those HFCs in our atmosphere, they can have a really, really outsized warming impact. The term that we use for that is called global warming potential. It means that they have a potential to increase the atmosphere's temperature to a very, very high degree. It looks like we might have a question.
So know that refrigeration bad, what can we do about it?
Yes, excellent question. We're getting to that just now. So it turns out that air conditioners, is there a second part to that?
Repeat the question.
Sure. The question was, what can we do about this refrigeration issue? Yes, absolutely. Excellent question. You beat me to the punch. So it turns out that those refrigerants that are released are contained within a special part of our air conditioning compressor units. And the vast majority of them are released after we dispose of the air conditioning unit. So what can we do personally with those refrigerators and air conditioners that we already have? We can dispose of them properly. It's not a very sexy solution, is it? But turns out this can have a really, really big impact. If we never break down the casing that contains those HFCs and we don't allow them to release in the first place, then they can't have that warming effect in our atmosphere. So if you've already got one of those units, don't panic, don't freak out. When it's time to get rid of the unit, dispose of it properly. And the secondary effect, of course, is for those of us budding engineers out there, we're actively looking for chemicals that can replace those HFCs so that we can still keep using our air conditioners. And it turns out that we've already stumbled across a few of those, but they each do have some warming impact as well. So some of those replacements might include hydrocarbons, different gaseous mixtures that contain carbon dioxide, and others, perhaps the most promising, that include ammonia. So these are technologies that right now the EPA actually has a great document on this. You can check those out. Those are replacements for refrigerants. Okay, so that's probably the longest you've ever talked about refrigerants, and probably the longest I've ever talked about refrigerants. 3 of the other top 10 solutions in the Drawdown book all have to do with different electricity producing technologies. Now, this won't come as a surprise to us, right? The second most important technology that Drawdown recognizes are wind turbines. In addition to wind turbines, we also see solar panels and solar fields. So that means we can have rooftop solar panels on our homes if, of course, we can afford them. They're very pricey. And also, we can have solar farms. And these are these are simply large fields that are covered in large, oversized solar panels. So I think we had another question, so I'll hit pause on that right there.
Sorry, going back, how do we know if we have one of these fridges, and when we go out to buy new ones, what do we look for?
Sure. So the question was, how do we know if we have one of these refrigerators? And when we go out to buy one, what do we look for? Well, I can answer the first part of the question. The first part of the question is, you probably already have this technology. And that has to do with the second part of the question. Right now, there is an agreement globally called the Kigali Agreement. And essentially this is a piece of international law, it's binding, that requires nations to develop new technologies to replace these existing harmful technologies. Now the problem is, or not the problem, but the reason that these technologies aren't widely distributed just yet is because we're still phasing into that law. So the United States actually just started having to phase in these new technologies. So these technologies are available. And again, I encourage you to check out, if you're really interested in this, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, has a document outlining alternative and new technologies to those harmful refrigerant chemicals. Again, I think that the leading technology is ammonia. Okay, so we'll close the door on that fridge talk, and we'll transition back then to the electricity production side of things. Now, we don't have to belabor this point. Everybody on this video call knows that it is most important that we move our electricity sector, i.e. our power plants, how we actually produce electricity, to clean or zero carbon technologies. So these are technologies that don't emit any carbon when we produce electricity. Now, of course, we know that burning fossil fuels, such as using coal or using even natural gas, releases those heat trapping gases into the atmosphere. Using wind turbines and using solar panels do not. So what can you do then to promote the incorporation of these technologies? Well, there are a few things. The first thing you can do, and this is in the spirit of Earth Day, certainly, is working with your community and working with your local elected officials to adopt what are called power purchase agreements. So this recommendation is for all the adults out there watching. Power purchase agreements are essentially big group buy-ins to be able to purchase large amounts of electricity, clean electricity. In fact, the city of Philadelphia just entered one itself to cover electricity produced by the city-owned buildings. You can actually do this on the neighborhood level or on the city level. It doesn't have to be run by a governmental system. So those are a little bit more complicated. You can do this though individually in your home as well, of course, by choosing your electricity provider. You have the flexibility to do this in the city of Philadelphia. PECO is our utility, and they offer a number of zero and clean electricity production options that you can purchase through them. They just distribute it. Okay. And then finally, if you'd like to obtain rooftop solar for your home, check out a program called Solarize Philly. Solarize Philly. And that's from the Philadelphia Energy Authority, and that helps essentially rebate the expense of some of those solar panels. Okie dokie. So how are we doing on time here? We're at about 22, so I'm going to skip ahead to some of the most surprising items on this list. And the first thing has to do, of course, with eating a plant-rich diet. Now, some of you out there may be familiar and may have already adjusted your personal and your family diets to reflect this decision. You may know that eating dairy products and eating meat products turns out is a particularly carbon-intensive act. Those meats that you might consider giving up once or twice a week, or permanently if you have the wherewithal to do so, include beef and lamb. And these two industries are particularly carbon intensive. Not just, we've heard about cows burping before, right? It turns out, yes, of course, cows do burp out methane, which is in and of itself a heat trapping gas. But they also convert forest lands, like those in the background behind me. They replace those trees, which remove carbon from the atmosphere, with grazing lands. And these begin to become not, instead of carbon sinks, they become carbon sources. So certainly the cattle production can be really, really bad for the environment. So adjusting to a plant-rich diet or a meatless diet can be a really, really good option. Again, if you're able to do so. The other thing that it's sort of food related here is reducing our food waste. Now, food waste, especially in industrialized countries, is extraordinary. So it turns out that something like a third or so of the food we produce gets thrown out eventually. And that's basically money that we're putting in to then throw away, and emissions that we're using to produce those vegetables and that produce. And it's going to waste, which is a real shame, especially when we could be moving that food towards food salvaging companies and organizations that help move that food to those communities that are greatest in need of it. One of the most interesting things that I find here about food waste is that a lot of that food waste is simply due to what we call cosmetic issues. So it simply means that the fruit or the vegetable we deem as too ugly to eat, which is outrageous, right? Does it matter if your potato is pretty or cute? No, of course not. We know that, of course, it's just as nutritious, just as delicious. So I would encourage all of us out there to certainly maybe relax some of those viewpoints on how we see food, and also to support some of those food recovery programs that I mentioned do exist. And you can look for those that exist in your town and especially at your local university to learn more about those. The final two topics that are included here in the top 10 drawdown actions that I mentioned include family planning and the education of girls. Now, these are kind of tricky and really sensitive topics to bring up when we're talking about carbon emissions. And what the heck do they have to do with? Well, of course, one way to avoid garnering a lot of carbon emissions is to have fewer children. Now, I certainly don't advocate myself for suggesting that scientists should suggest what the right size of a family is. Certainly not about that. But what we're talking about here is increasing the education and the access, certainly to contraception, and the understanding and the knowledge and the wherewithal of young women and girls to understand proper family planning techniques. Now, it does turn out that globally, the more education that young women have, the less children they tend to have. I think it's something like for each 12 years of education, that particular person, that woman, has 4 to 5 fewer children, which is pretty extraordinary here. So again, we're not advocating for any kind of outrageous Malthusian population control, nothing like this. No. It's simply about recognizing that families should be planned when families are ready to be planned. This could have a really, really outsized impact then on population moving forward. Okie dokie. So we've gone over some of the more surprising, potentially climate mitigating impacts that the Project Drawdown outlines. And I think I'm going to pivot just a bit now to how you can learn more about these actions through the Drawdown Project on your laptop. So while I'm queuing that page up, I'll ask if Amy has any more questions for us.
We have two.
Sure.
So I've heard that you should unplug appliances and other tech when you're not using them. Do they really use electricity when they're not on?
So the question is an excellent one, and it's about electronics. And the question was, do electronics that are plugged in, even when they're not being used, even when they're not powered on, do they still use electricity? And the answer is yes. It turns out that TV monitors, computer monitors are particularly bad at this. And there's a word for it. It's called vampires. Now, it sort of sounds, they're acting just as it sounds. So vampires suck our blood. Well, it turns out that our TV monitors suck our electricity. And that's a horrible, horrible vampire accent. I'm going to have to work on that. But yes, so we can have vampire electronics. You can check out just how much those individual electronics are using by purchasing a small device called a kilowatt. K-I-L-L, a watt. It's kind of a play on the electricity unit, kilowatt, K-I-L-O, watt. And a kilowatt is a simple device that plugs into your wall unit and offers you another plug-in where you can plug in where your TV monitor or your computer monitor would have plugged into the wall, and it will give you the actual output of electricity being used when that item is off. So I definitely recommend, yes, unplugging those vampire devices. Another question.
One last question. For solar cell or solar panels,
yes,
is there any trade-off we should be thinking about in terms of reduction of carbon emission versus any toxic chemicals used in constructing the solar panel?
Yes, it's an absolutely excellent question. And the question was about the trade-off between the production of solar panels and the intensity that is the energy-intensive process to produce those panels themselves. Should we be thinking about the trade-off between that production and between our actual usage? I.e., that's to say, if I switch to a solar panel, am I doing any good than I was before when it comes to overall lifetime carbon emissions? The answer to that final question is yes, ultimately. But what we need to think about here again, and this is unfortunately out of our individual action, and this is where some of that political action is required, and it's making sure that those supply chains and those production processes, those engineering processes that we're using are regulated in a way that's not detrimental to the environments that we're mining from. It is absolutely true that those solar panels do use a lot of, in particular, silicon. Now, where does silicon come from? Well, it comes from the rocks. Turns out silicon is the most abundant mineral on the surface, most abundant element, on the surface of the Earth. And the particular silicon dioxide, the quartz that we end up mining in part to use, comes from rocks, and those rocks come from somewhere. Often those rocks are coming from not the United States, right? We're finding that these industries are popping up in areas that have more lax environmental regulations. And it's beyond just mining for that silicon. It's also mining for rare earth elements. You may have heard about rare earth elements in the past. And this is a really big challenge, not just in solar panels themselves, but in the production of batteries. Now, another challenge we haven't talked about yet is if we're even able to continue growing our ability to produce electricity, what are we going to do with all of that electricity? Well, we need to store it. Right now, the electricity grid in the United States is very, very inefficient at storing electricity. And so one way to ameliorate or fix that issue is to install big battery centers, essentially. So yes, absolutely, that's a consideration and a trade-off to make. So I'd just like to draw your attention then to a website that has to do with that drawdown project I mentioned, and we're going to drop that link in the description of the video, and it's called drawdown.ecochallenge.org. So if you want a challenge for your family on this Earth Day, I encourage you to check out drawdown.ecochallenge.org to really work through each and every one of those activities that you can take on as a family, or again, working together as a community to reduce your carbon intensity. Okay, were you waiting for me for another question? No, we were distracted there. Okie dokie. So that's the high-level overview on climate actions. Now, it turns out, of course, that there are dozens that we could explore. If you have questions, definitely message me. I'm always happy to talk in great detail about anything that we just discussed, or about any of those that you have questions about in your own lives. Now I'd like to pivot pretty strongly, actually, and we're going to come full circle here. And remember, we're outside on this beautiful breezy day celebrating our Franklin Outside project. And for the next 3 days, I'm going to be participating in a very special Earth Day collaboration, and I hope all of you will join with me. Now, it's not going to be about climate actions, those things that I just mentioned that I'm already doing, I'm already thinking about, and now you have the resources to do so as well. But this is going to be an activity that helps me, again, in the spirit of Franklin Outside, really open our eyes to the beautiful environment that's around us and take in a little bit more detail about it and learn a little bit more about it. And this is going to be through a program called the City Nature Challenge. Now, if you haven't participated in the City Nature Challenge before, you are missing out. You're definitely going to get your friends and your family members in on this action. So the City Nature Challenge is a digital effort that's supported by the National Geographic Society and the Cal Academy of Sciences. They've been doing this for many years now, and they use an app called iNaturalist. Now, many folks out there will already be familiar with iNaturalist. If you're an iNatter already, welcome back. And I hope to learn a whole heck of a lot from you. I know iNatter is kind of a corny thing here, but it's a badge of honor. We should wear it with pride. And if we're iNatters, it means that we're appreciating the environment that's around us, right? So what I had hoped to do was pull up the website and walk you a bit through it on my laptop here. But it turns out that the lighting that we have, we couldn't make it work for you. So what instead I'm going to do is I'm going to turn your attention to the other link that we've dropped in this video description, and it's to our blog from last Sunday. Through there, you can learn how to participate alongside me and all of your fellow Philadelphians in the City Nature Challenge. Now, this year, we and our collaborators are seeing the challenge as an opportunity really for collaboration instead of a challenge. And in previous years, the challenge is all about gaining more observations on that app that I mentioned, iNaturalist, than any of the other participating cities, than any of the other participating teams. All that you need to do to participate in iNaturalist City Nature Challenge is to download the app. It's freely available on your iPhone or your Android. And then to take photos. Between Thursday, Friday, Saturday, after this video, again, that's April 23rd, 4th, and 5th, I'll be participating. Hopefully you will be as well. And any photos that are taken within the county of Philadelphia and all of the surrounding counties will go towards our Philadelphia team's observations. Now, just a couple quick tips on taking some of those nature photos, and then I'll let you go here. The first tip, you're going to want to make sure that you get up close and personal. Is there a specimen that you want to look at? It can be a bird, it can be a tree, it can be a bug, any natural specimen that you see around you in your environment that you want to learn more about. Get up nice and close to it. Second thing, of course, and this is quite easy with our new smartphones, make sure that the photo is really well focused and sharp. You want to make sure that the specimen that you're looking at is right in the center of the camera. You don't want it really halfway off over here or halfway off over here, right? You want to make sure that you're up close and personal. If you're looking at a tree species, you might consider looking at its leaves. Turns out that the leaves and the buds of trees are particularly helpful in identifying what that species is. Now the final little bit, remember we said you want to make sure you get up close and personal, and you want to make sure that that photo is nice and sharp. The final little bit is make sure to take multiple photos from multiple angles. This is particularly helpful in identifying different critters. Now bugs, for example, are a really good example here. We can take a photo up above their backs, what's called their carapace, but maybe I want to see more about their feet. So I want to make sure I take another photo up close against their legs, and maybe also I want to take a photo of their antennae. All of this information is really, really useful to understanding the biodiversity of our environments. And I think that's a really beautiful note to end on here on a day that we're celebrating the Earth and our environment. Biodiversity is one indicator of the health of our environment. And all of this information is a gigantic citizen science effort. So just by you going out with your friends and family, again, remember we're proper social distancing here, it's going out. All of that information that you're collecting is ultimately going towards a real scientific research project. So after those 3 days of photo collection that you'll be participating in with me, then me and a bunch of really, really smart ecologists and environmental scientists and biologists are going to look through those photos and begin to identify what they are. Okay, so over the next 3 days, I hope you'll follow along with us. Some of those best finds and some of my favorites, I hope you'll share out yours, and I'll be sharing out mine, and we'll continue following along with that hashtag Franklin Outside signature. So I think that does it for us today on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So remember, we talked about the importance of Earth Day and its real legacy. Celebrate today, and celebrate today perhaps by going out and taking some of those observations using that iNaturalist app. Again, you can get those details in the links we provided. I hope to see you out here soon from a distance. This is Dr. Dawn signing off, saying a very, very happy 50th anniversary of Earth Day to you.